All she had done was offer one man a cup of coffee. Now her home was completely surrounded by riders, wearing the infamous winged death head of the Hells Angels. The siege had shattered the quiet of her street, beginning as a faint vibration in her chest before escalating into the full-blown thunder of 80 idling motorcycles. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't just fall, it attacked. It came in sideways sheets, battering the cedar siding of Sarah Jenkins' isolated home at the very edge of Route 9. 2 years into her widowhood, Sarah had learned to find comfort in the isolation. Her property was divided into two parts, her modest two-bedroom home in the back, and a small attached roadside diner she called the Rusty Bean, facing the highway. It was an old-fashioned setup, a relic of a bygone era, serving black coffee, homemade cherry pie, and solitude to tired truckers and lost tourists. On this particular late November Friday, the storm had chased away every potential customer by 3 in the afternoon. The sky had turned a bruised, violent purple, and the wind howled through the towering Douglas firs that flanked her property. Sarah was wiping down the laminate counter, her mind drifting to the stack of past-due bills on her kitchen table when the sound of a sputtering, backfiring engine cut through the gale. She paused, the damp rag in her hand suddenly motionless. The heavy, guttural sound of a V-twin engine was distinct, but it sounded sickly, drowning in the torrential downpour. Then the engine died completely. Through the rain-streaked window of the diner, Sarah squinted into the gloom. A massive figure was pushing a heavy touring motorcycle up the slight incline of her gravel driveway. The man was drenched, leaning his entire body weight into the handlebars as the mud sucked at his heavy boots. He finally parked the dead machine under the narrow overhang of her diner's roof, slapping the kickstand down with a frustrated metallic clack. Sarah's breath hitched as the man stepped into the dim glow of her neon open sign. The details of his leather cut became terrifyingly clear. The top rocker read Hell's Angels. Beneath it was the unmistakable center patch, the winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet, universally known as the Death Head. And below that, the bottom rocker indicating his charter territory, though the rain obscured the specific state. On his lapel, a small diamond-shaped patch read 1%, a proud declaration that he belonged to the 1% of motorcycle riders operating outside the law. Sarah was 52, living alone, miles from the nearest sheriff's deputy. She knew the reputation of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. She had read the news stories, seen the documentaries about organized crime, turf wars, and the fierce, unyielding brotherhood that did not tolerate disrespect. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She instinctively reached under the counter where she kept a heavy wooden baseball bat. The man approached the glass door. He didn't knock aggressively. Instead, he simply tapped a heavy leather-gloved knuckle against the pane. He looked exhausted. His graying beard was matted to his chin, and water poured from his shoulders in rivulets. Sarah hesitated. Her survival instinct screamed at her to lock the deadbolt, turn off the neon sign, and hide in the back room until he left. But as she looked into the man's face, stripped of his helmet, she saw something that gave her pause. His eyes were deeply lined, carrying a heavy, hollow grief that she recognized instantly. It was the same look she saw in the mirror every morning since her husband Thomas had passed away. Empathy, foolish and overpowering, won the battle against fear. Sarah unlocked the door and pushed it open against the wind. "We're technically closed," she called out over the storm, her voice trembling only slightly. "But you look like you're about to freeze to death. Come inside." The biker looked surprised. He hesitated, glancing down at his muddy boots. "I'll track mud all over your floor, ma'am. Just need to use a phone. Cell service is dead. The floor is linoleum. It mops up," Sarah said, stepping aside. "Come in. Before I change my mind." He stepped over the threshold, bringing with him the smell of wet leather, gasoline, and cold rain. He was a mountain of a man, towering over Sarah's 5'4" frame. He carefully unzipped his soaking wet leather jacket, treating the Hells Angels colors with extreme reverence, and draped it over a wooden stool to dry. Underneath, he wore a simple black t-shirt. "I'm Arthur," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "Most call me Bones." "Sarah," she replied, moving behind the counter. She felt a strange, surreal calmness washing over her. "Sit by the radiator, Arthur. I'm making a fresh pot of coffee." For the next hour, a bizarre tableau played out in the empty, storm-lashed diner. Bones sat near the hissing radiator, nursing a steaming mug of dark roast coffee and quietly destroying a massive slice of Sarah's warm cherry pie. The intimidating aura of the Hells Angel seemed to melt away in the warmth of the room. They began to talk. At first it was just the weather, and his bike, the alternator, had completely died, leaving him stranded. But as the coffee flowed, the conversation deepened. Bones revealed that he was riding alone, separated from his pack, because he was returning from a funeral. "A brother of mine," Bones said, staring down into the black liquid in his mug. "Known him for 30 years. Cancer took him. Ain't exactly a warrior's death, but he fought it like one." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said softly, wiping the counter down. "My husband, Thomas, died 2 years ago. Heart attack. It's a hard road to walk alone." Bones looked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just gave a slow, understanding nod. "The road doesn't care who it takes," he murmured. "But the people left behind, we carry the miles for them." It was a surprisingly poetic sentiment from a man wearing a death head on his back. They shared stories. Sarah talked about Thomas's love for old muscle cars, and Bones talked about the freedom of the highway, carefully omitting any of the club's illicit business. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't a member of the world's most notorious motorcycle club, and she wasn't a lonely widow struggling to make ends meet. They were just two weary travelers taking shelter from the storm. Eventually, the landline phone behind the counter proved useful. Bones made a brief, cryptic call to someone in the local chapter. "Yeah, it's Bones, Route 9. The alternator is fried. Bring the flatbed." "No, I'm good. A lady here took me in." 45 minutes later, the blinding headlights of a heavy-duty tow truck pierced the gloom outside. Two men, also wearing the Hells Angels cuts over heavy hoodies, quickly and silently loaded Bones' disabled motorcycle onto the flatbed. Bones stood up, pulling his semi-dry leather jacket back on. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a damp $50 bill, placing it on the counter. "Arthur, coffee is $1.50, and the pie is $3." Sarah said, pushing the bill back toward him. "Keep it." Bones placed a heavy hand over hers, gently but firmly pressing the money back onto the counter. "You don't understand, Sarah," he said, his tone suddenly incredibly serious, shifting back from the weary traveler to the hardened club member. "You didn't have to open that door for me. You saw the patch. You knew what it meant. But you treated me like a human being on a day I really needed to feel like one." He picked up his helmet and looked her dead in the eye. "The Hells Angels don't forget a slight," Bones said quietly. "But we sure as hell don't forget a kindness either. Thank you, Sarah." With that, he walked out into the fading rain, climbed into the cab of the tow truck, and disappeared down the dark highway. Sarah locked the door behind him, the $50 bill feeling strangely heavy in her hand. She turned off the neon sign and went back to her house, unaware that her life was about to be turned upside down. By 7 o'clock that evening, the storm had finally broken. The heavy clouds fractured, allowing a sliver of blood-red sunset to bleed across the horizon before plunging the world into total darkness. The air was frigid, carrying the crisp, sharp scent of pine needles and wet earth. Sarah was in her small kitchen at the back of the house, scrubbing the remnants of flour from her baking bowls. The encounter with Arthur Bones Holloway already felt like a bizarre dream. She had taken the $50 bill and pinned it to the corkboard next to her refrigerator, a strange souvenir from a brush with the criminal underworld. She turned on the small television on her counter, letting the drone of the evening news fill the quiet of the house. It started exactly at 7:15 p.m. Sarah was at the sink when she felt it. A faint rhythmic vibration traveling up through the floorboards into the soles of her slippers. She turned off the faucet, frowning. She listened closely. It sounded like a low-flying airplane or perhaps a massive convoy of logging trucks making a late-night run down Route 9. But the sound was too consistent, too throaty. It was a guttural, synchronized mechanical roar that seemed to be vibrating the very air inside her kitchen. The water in her soaking pots began to ripple. The windows rattled in their wooden frames. The sound was multiplying. It wasn't one engine. It was 10, then 20, then 50. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, her heart rate suddenly spiking. She walked quickly to the short hallway connecting her house to the diner, stepping behind the front counter. She peered out the front window into the pitch-black night. Down the long, straight stretch of Route 9, a river of headlights was cutting through the darkness. They were riding in a tight, disciplined 2-by-2 staggered formation. The noise was deafening now, a thunderous symphony of highly tuned exhaust pipes that drowned out the television and shook the diner's front door on its hinges. "They're just passing by," Sarah told herself, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. "It's a club ride. They're just passing by." But they weren't passing by. The lead rider, a man on a heavily customized black chopper, raised his left arm, signaling the pack. He slowed down, downshifting with a massive crack of the exhaust, and turned his front wheel onto the gravel of Sarah's driveway. Like a perfectly choreographed military unit, the endless stream of motorcycles followed him. They poured into the parking lot of the Rusty Bean. They filled the spaces meant for cars. They parked along the grass shoulder. They choked the entire driveway leading up to her front porch. The beams of 50 headlights swept across the front of her diner, illuminating the interior like an interrogation room. Sarah stumbled back from the window, pressing herself against the wall, utterly terrified. Every single rider wore the same leather cut. Every single back bore the winged death head of the Hells Angels. The sheer volume of men massive, bearded, clad in leather, denim, and heavy chains was overwhelming. The parking lot looked like a scene from an invasion. Across the street, Sarah saw her elderly neighbor, Mr. Pascal Henderson, step onto his porch. He took one look at the army of outlaws swarming Sarah's property, immediately shut off his porch light, and slammed his door closed. She was entirely alone. Her mind raced in a frantic loop. What did I do? Did I offend him? Was the coffee bad? Did I say something wrong about his dead friend? Is this a shakedown? Are they going to burn the place down? The media stories she had seen flashed through her mind, bars torn apart. Brutal retaliations, a brotherhood operating by its own violent code. She reached under the counter and wrapped her trembling fingers around the handle of the wooden baseball bat. It felt ridiculously pathetic, like holding a twig against a hurricane. Outside, the lead rider cut his engine. In a cascading wave, the rest of the pack followed suit. The sudden silence that fell over the property was heavier and more suffocating than the roar of the engines had been. The only sounds were the ting-ting-ting of hot metal cooling in the damp air and the heavy crunch of leather boots hitting the gravel. Nobody spoke. The discipline of the group was terrifying. They stood by their bikes, a silent army, waiting for a command. From the center of the pack, a man stepped forward. He was not Bones. This man was younger, but built like a brick wall, wearing a leather cut adorned with several patches that Sarah couldn't read from the distance, except for the one over his left breast that caught the gleam of the distant street lamp. Trust an entry. He had a thick, dark beard, a heavily tattooed neck, and a demeanor that radiated absolute authority. He didn't look angry, but he looked intense like a coiled spring. The sea of bikers parted for him as he walked deliberately toward the front door of the Rusty Bean. Sarah's breath was trapped in her lungs. She couldn't move. She watched as the president of the Hells Angels chapter stepped onto her wooden porch, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. He stopped directly in front of the glass door. He didn't knock. He simply leaned his face close to the glass, shielding his eyes from the glare, and looked inside. He spotted her cowering behind the counter. "Sarah Jenkins?" His voice boomed through the glass, deep and commanding. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't hide. She was trapped. Slowly, her hand shaking so badly she could barely operate the lock, she stepped out from behind the counter, leaving the baseball bat behind. If they wanted her dead, a piece of wood wouldn't stop them. She turned the deadbolt with a loud click and opened the door a few inches, peering out at the towering man, surrounded by a sea of silent, staring Hell's Angels. "Yes," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "I'm Sarah." The president looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then slowly he reached a heavily tattooed hand inside his leather jacket. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively bracing herself for whatever violence was about to erupt from the man's heavy leather jacket. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. The president's hand emerged, but instead of the cold glint of steel, he was holding a thick, weathered manila envelope. He held it out toward her. Sarah slowly opened her eyes, staring at the offering, too paralyzed by confusion to raise her hands. "Take it," the man said. His voice was a low, rumbling bass, completely devoid of the malice she had expected. Trembling, Sarah reached out and took the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. "What? What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the lingering chill of the night air. "If I did something wrong, I swear I didn't know. The man, Arthur, he just needed to use the phone." The president held up a massive calloused hand, stopping her frantic apology. "You didn't do anything wrong, Sarah. My name is Gage. I'm the president of this charter." He pointed a thick finger back toward the highway. "The man you call Arthur is Bones. And he isn't just a writer, he's one of the original founders of this club. He's my uncle." Sarah stared at Gage, trying to process the information. "He said he was coming back from a funeral." Gage's hardened expression cracked, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a profound, exhausted sorrow. He buried his son yesterday. 32 years old. Leukemia ate him alive from the inside out." Sarah gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The hollow look in Bones's eyes, the quiet resignation as he spoke about carrying the miles for the people left behind, it suddenly snapped into a devastatingly clear focus. "Bones has been riding with us for 40 years, Gage continued, his voice tight. "He's the toughest son of a bitch I've ever known. But losing his boy broke him. When he left the cemetery yesterday, he didn't tell anyone where he was going. But we knew. He was riding out to the coast. He was going to find a cliff on Route 9, open the throttle and follow his kid into the dark." The gravity of Gage's words hung in the damp air. The entire army of bikers behind him stood in absolute, reverent silence. His alternator dying was a mechanical fluke, Gage said, leaning slightly closer. "But you unlocking that door, you sitting with him, letting him talk about your husband, letting him feel like a normal man instead of a grieving ghost, that wasn't a fluke. That saved his life. When he called us for the chow, he was a different man. He snapped out of it. He came home." Sarah looked down at the thick manila envelope in her hands. Her vision blurred with sudden, hot tears. "Open it," Gage instructed gently. Sarah peeled back the metal clasp and looked inside. It was packed with stacks of $20, $50, and $100 bills. It had to be thousands of dollars. "I can't take this," Sarah said immediately, trying to push the envelope back into Gage's chest. "Gage, please. It was just a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. You don't owe me anything." Gage didn't move his hands to take it back. He simply crossed his arms over his chest, the leather of his cut groaning. "You don't understand how this brotherhood works, Sarah," Gage said, his tone turning fiercely serious. "When you save one of our own, you save all of us. You kept our elder alive. That money in your hand, every single man out in that parking lot emptied his wallet tonight. That's not charity. That's a debt being paid." Before Sarah could protest again, Gage turned his back to her and faced the sea of heavily armed, fiercely intimidating outlaws. He raised both of his arms in the air. "All right, boys," Gage roared, his voice echoing off the surrounding pine trees. "Let's get to work." What happened next defied every single preconceived notion Sarah Jenkins had ever held about the criminal underworld. From the back of the staggered formation, a heavy-duty Julie pickup truck rumbled forward, its headlights cutting through the pack. It parked right next to the diner. Four massive bikers hopped out of the cab and dropped the tailgate. They weren't pulling out weapons or contraband. They were pulling out extension ladders, heavy-duty tool belts, floodlights, and stacks of roofing shingles. Sarah watched in stunned, absolute disbelief as the Hells Angels swarmed her property. It was like a highly militarized, heavily tattooed version of an extreme home makeover. A biker named Wyatt, whose face was covered in a sprawling web of scar tissue, hauled a massive floodlight onto her front lawn, illuminating the entire diner in brilliant white light. A group of 5 men, their heavy boots thudding against the side of the building, instantly scaled her roof. Within minutes, the sound of tearing asphalt and hammering echoed into the night. They were patching the severe leak over her kitchen that she hadn't been able to afford to fix for a year. Down in the parking lot, another crew was hauling bags of cold patch asphalt out of the truck, systematically filling the deep, treacherous potholes that plagued her driveway. "Gage, what are they doing?" Sarah cried over the noise, clutching the envelope of cash to her chest. "Paying the interest," Gage replied simply, pulling a pair of heavy leather work gloves from his belt. "Bones noticed your roof was missing shingles, and your driveway was chewing up tires. We take care of our own, Sarah. And tonight, you're our own." For the next 6 hours, Sarah Jenkins hosted the most surreal gathering her diner had ever seen. The terror had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. She couldn't just stand there and watch, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She went into her kitchen, tied her apron tight, and started cooking. She brewed pot after pot of dark roast coffee. She scrambled 3 dozen eggs, fried every strip of bacon she had in the walk-in cooler, and baked 2 fresh batches of biscuits. As the bikers worked in shifts, they filed into the diner. These men who carried reputations of violence and illicit trade sat at her modest laminate tables, politely asking for sugar, thanking her for the refills, and laughing with deep, booming voices that shook the windows. A giant of a man introduced to her only as Tiny, who had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the doorframe, spent 2 hours meticulously rewiring her flickering neon open sign until it buzzed with a steady, brilliant crimson glow. Another biker, a younger prospect with a fresh patch, spent the entire night scrubbing the grime and moss off the cedar siding of her house until it looked brand new. They worked with a frantic, devoted energy. There was no complaining, no loitering. They moved with the synchronized precision of an army unit executing a vital mission. By 5:05 a.m., the first bruised hues of dawn began to creep over the tops of the Douglas firs. The floodlights were clicked off. The heavy tools were loaded back into the pickup truck. Sarah stood on her front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand, staring at her property. The sagging gutters were rehung and cleared. The roof was entirely patched. The driveway was smooth and level. The neon sign blazed defiantly against the early morning mist. The diner hadn't looked this cared for since Thomas was alive. The 80 motorcycles fired up, one by one, a rolling wave of thunder that no longer sounded terrifying to her ears. It sounded like protection, Gage walked up the steps of the porch one last time. He was covered in sawdust and grease, looking exhausted but deeply satisfied. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small rectangular red and white sticker, and pressed it firmly onto the glass of her front door, right at eye level. It read, "Support your local BID red machine." "Keep that on the glass," Gage told her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Nobody touches this place. Not local kids, not drifters, not other clubs. You ever have a problem, you tell them who your friends are. We'll be here before the cops even pick up the phone." Sarah looked at the sticker, then back at the imposing president. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, tracking down her flour-dusted cheeks. "Thank you, Gage. Tell Arthur. Tell Bones I'm thinking of him." Gage gave a single respectful nod. "He knows." He turned, walked down the steps, and swung his massive frame over his black chopper. He kicked the engine to life, raised his left arm, and chopped it forward. With a deafening, unified roar, the Hells Angels pulled out of her driveway, merging onto Route 9 in a perfect, staggered formation, chasing the rising sun until they disappeared from sight. Sarah Jenkins never felt isolated again. The Rusty Bean thrived, drawing curious locals and respectful riders who treated her with unwavering reverence. She learned that monsters and guardian angels sometimes wear the exact same worn leather jackets. Empathy, she realized, remains the world's most powerful universal currency. When you pour a warm cup of coffee for a broken stranger in the dark, you never know what light will actually return.